Okay, good morning and welcome to this final Get in Shape webinar for 2021. A year I'm sure we're very happy to see the back of. And unlike the passing of 2020 into 2021, it does feel like the move from 2021 to 2022 might be a bit of a game change as we move from the old 4-level system into the traffic light system, which despite high cases, gives us a little bit more freedom, chances to move around, do some exercise, see people, maybe even shake hands, which would be quite exciting, not to mention going out to cafes and having the odd beer. Although members of from around the country, I'm sure you've been doing that for a number of months now. Those of us in Auckland have just forgotten a little bit what it's like and are looking forward to it. Over the course of this year, we've had a number of different topics in this Get in Shape series, and you can find the recordings of the previous webinars at advice.fsc.org.nz. That's the professional advice hub, advice.fsc.org.nz. We've had topics like how to adapt to the new regime, navigating the education obligations, the code of conduct and the customer journey around the code of conduct, business continuity plans and cybersecurity, commercial considerations, financial management, those sorts of things. And today is the beastie topic, the one about compliance. When we recently surveyed advisors, we found that compliance was the area that most advisors were not so comfortable with. What exactly is this beast of compliance? What does this mean? And how do we do it? So that is the topic of today's conversation. We are tremendously lucky today to have two fantastic people to talk to us about this. The first is Karty Mayne. Now, when Karty and I worked together at the FMA, I was in the intelligence space. Karty was running a team that did supervision and did most of the license applications around the Financial Markets Conduct Act. So I, over the last couple of years, when I've talked to people about Karty or introduced Karty, said I think that Karty knows more about FMA licensing than anyone outside the FMA and probably a lot of the people in the FMA. So we're very, very lucky to have Karty here to talk to us about this topic. And then joining Karty is Alistair Robertson, who is a lawyer, but has a very strong compliance background. Not only does he have honours degrees from both Cambridge and Oxford, which is kind of scary, really. He has been head of compliance at ANZ, so has a very strong background in the compliance space and is now special counsel at MinterEllisonRuddWatts. So we are very, very fortunate to have two such knowledgeable speakers this morning. And first up, I would like to hand over to Alistair.
Thanks for that, Mark. Thanks for that introduction. I'll try to live up to that during the course of this presentation. So I'll just sort of kick off on, if we could switch to the first slide, please, Carissa, with the kind of overview as to why compliance and having an adequate and well-designed compliance framework and compliance assurance program is important. And I'm sure everybody listening probably realizes it's important and gets the importance of doing it, but I'm just going to take it back, I guess, to the legal obligations that underpin the license environment in which you're operating and which underscores the importance of having these things in place. So I guess the first point to remember, which hopefully everyone's conscious of, but it bears reiterating, I think, is that it's important to remember licensing is not a one-off process. It's not a question of you submit your full license application, you're granted that license application, and you sort of put the application away in a drawer and you move on. Once you're licensed, whether you're subject to a wide range of ongoing obligations, and you're also subject to the additional powers the FMA has under the Financial Markets Conduct Act in respect of licensed entities. And in the case of a full license, this is reinforced by the standard condition 6 of the full license conditions, which requires that you must at all times continue to satisfy the eligibility requirements for a license, including that you're able to effectively provide the license service. You're also subject, and this applies whether you're operating under a transitional license or under a full license, to a requirement under section 412 of FMCA that you have to have in place effective methods for monitoring your compliance with your Financial Markets Conduct Act obligations and identifying any material changes in circumstances. And I'll go on to talk later in this presentation about what a material change of circumstance means. So now you're in this, you've got these ongoing obligations that you need to comply with. The other point to be aware of, and I think that goes to what we'll talk about later in this session, is there's a wide range. Well, the obligations to which you're subject as a licensed FAP are extensive, detailed, and also spread across a wide range of different sources of obligations. So the Financial Markets Conduct Act itself imposes compliance obligations on you, as do the Financial Markets Conduct Regulations. The standard conditions for FAT licenses impose further conditions, and then you also need to be conscious of the requirements of the Code of Conduct for professional advisors. So there's obviously, given that range and disparate sources of obligations, there's obviously some value in recording those in a structured way and putting in place a structured process to ensure that you are meeting those obligations. I'll just touch on here the next bullet, which is once you're now that you're in the licensed environment, FMA has a range of broader powers that it can exercise in respect of financial advisor business than it could under the previous regime. So those range from fines or pecuniary penalties, as they're called in the legislation, which can be up to $5 million for a company in some circumstances. But more, I guess, significantly in this context, FMA has a number of other powers that it can use in respect of a licensed FAP where it considers that it's not complying with its obligations. That can include things like suspending or cancelling your license, or imposing some restrictive conditions on the types of financial advice business that you may conduct, so thereby materially affecting or even putting you out of business. It can also give licensees directions requiring them to take certain steps, or require licensees to put in place an action plan and respond and follow the directions in the action plan that they submit to FMA. There's also, and I'll talk about this later, ongoing reporting requirements to FMA in respect of compliance breaches and compliance matters. So I guess the key takeaway from all that is that having a comprehensive and structured compliance framework and compliance assurance program is of probably of vital importance in helping you meet these obligations, ensuring you know what it is that you need to do, ensuring that you have assurance that you know you're doing those things, and enabling you to demonstrate that to FMA when needed, and to meet your ongoing reporting obligations. So we can go to that next slide, please, Clarissa. I guess the starting point for designing your compliance framework and compliance assurance program is the guidance that FMA has put out on this. So as you're probably all aware, the FMA's FAP license application guide sets out FMA's expectations for compliance and oversight processes. One thing to note is that FMA sort of requires that you have an oversight body which will be responsible for ensuring your compliance and considering how you're complying on an ongoing basis. In a large organization, that could be a formal committee. In a smaller organization, it may just be the FAP itself or a single director. The guidance makes it clear that your compliance processes should cover all the key elements of your business. And it goes further than simply recording the processes that you have in place. You need to have in place processes which test compliance and give you assurance that those processes are operating effectively. And FMA's Compliance Assurance Program information sheet, which is shown on the slide there, provides further detailed guidance on the elements and design of a compliance assurance program. I would encourage you all to read that if you have not done so already, because it is comprehensible and gives some pretty clear guidance and steers on these areas. Next slide. Over to Karty now.
Thanks, Alistair, and thanks a lot for that fantastic introduction, Mark. It's great to be here. I think it's appropriate that our last webinar of the year addresses compliance, because when you go through regulatory change, normally your compliance program is the last thing that you do. You start by building your policies and procedures and your response to the new regulatory requirements. And then once you've got those in place and you start to implement them into your business, then compliance is all about, well, how do we know that we're actually complying? So there's sort of three key terms that you'll come across when you're dealing with a regulator in terms of compliance in New Zealand. So I think it's just helpful if we just get all on the same page about what we mean by those terms. So compliance is really, what is that frontline activity that you're going to do to make sure that you're meeting that obligation that Alistair talked about? The second one is the compliance framework. So this is your everything that you have in your business to ensure that you are complying and identifying your obligations. So it could be a whole range of different things, and for every business, it will be different. And then the final thing is your compliance assurance program. Now, not to be confused with a compliance program, but a compliance assurance program is all about how do you know that your compliance framework is in place and working effectively. So you might have things like a compliance program for anti-money laundering legislation, for example. That's the system of policies and procedures and everything that you have in place to comply with the Act. But the compliance assurance bit is the road testing that program. How do you know that your compliance is in place and effective? So let's just unpick those a little bit more. So we'll move on to the next slide. We'll talk a bit about that. What are the elements of that compliance framework? So these are going to be different depending on what size business that you are. So if you're a very small business, it could be that you have all these components, but they may be quite informal. So for example, you don't need a whole written framework about culture of your business if really you're a one-man band. But that's quite different if you are part of a very large organisation, or maybe what we're seeing now is very large financial advice provider businesses with a number of authorised bodies sitting under their licence. So the more complex that your business gets, the more that you need to think about drafting out the elements of this compliance framework, because you really need everyone on the same page in terms of what we mean by these different areas and what we have in place. So just generally, they're quite common to all types of businesses. So you've got things like your policies and procedures, the type of training and communications, because really training goes hand in hand with compliance. If you don't train your team, how do they know what they've got to comply with? So you're also going to have different processes in place and different controls. We'll talk about those. And it's really important to have monitoring and reporting so that your oversight body actually knows what you're doing and what's going on. And you've obviously got to have some sort of resource to do this piece of work. It's very hard to check on your own homework. So it's important to find somebody else who can help check and test and have that external view in terms of what this looks like for your business and if it's working properly. So if you're a large business, or if you've got lots of components to your business, there's a bit more complexity to it, then what I'm doing with businesses now, we're actually creating a whole compliance framework document in its own right. And all it's doing is describing what the business has in place. Now, I'm running regular training with compliance officers how to do this, and they're actually finding this piece of work very hard. So if you're doing it for the first time and you're struggling, that's okay. Think of it as a long-term work in progress that you'll add to it over time. And then as you get more and more conversant with your compliance framework, you'll find it so much easier to describe. So let's move on now to our next slide, where we talk about, well, what is the elements of the compliance assurance program? So again, it depends on the size and scale of your business. So if you're going for a financial advice provider license, and I'm picking up on that one because I know that that's, a number of our listeners are going through that at the moment. So what it says in your license guide, it says that your oversight and compliance functions should cover all of the listed components and have sufficient scope to be able to monitor the business effectively ensure all that your licence obligations are met. So the FMA says they expect oversight and compliance functions to be fit for purpose and relevant to the licence class. So what they mean there is, if you're a class 1 type licence, and so you're a one-man band, it's perfectly acceptable to have a very simple framework. However, if you're a class 2 or 3, then obviously it needs to be more formal, more documented to demonstrate what you do, how you do it, and how often you'll do the type of activities that sit around it. So the extent and the type of testing that you'll do will depend on things like the nature and size of the business, obviously, how many financial advisors or how many regulated activities that you're doing under your licence. So you look at things like how your systems and processes have been designed, but very much you look at the types and level of risk that's in your business. So we talk about taking a risk-based approach. So what we mean by that is the more risk there is in that particular area, or the more reliant you are on that area keeping you safe, the more focus and activity you want in that place, because that's what you're relying on to meet your obligations. And also it's in terms of how involved your directors or your oversight body is in overseeing your day-to-day functions. Some directors are very hands-on and involved in the process, so they will know a lot more about what's going on in practice, and they won't want so much testing and reporting information. However, you might have an oversight body that's more removed from the business, and they might meet on a monthly or a quarterly basis, and then they need to hear your eyes and ears about what's happening in the business, what compliance activities you're doing, and what it's telling them about the business. And I think it's really important that when you do compliance activities, you actually want to demonstrate what's working well, not just where the gaps are and what's not working well. So it's a balance of both, because if you know the controls are in place and they're working, that's very helpful for the business and anyone overseeing the business. So what the license application says for small FAPs is, if you've got a simple structure, you're able to rely more on knowledge of the business and do less testing. You may be able to focus on testing on areas where there are particular risks or where you've got less frequent oversight, instead of comprehensively testing all areas of the business, because there'll be some areas that don't change a lot. So, for example, if your directors, senior managers, key people in the business don't change a lot, there's no point doing very regular testing on the fit and proper requirements. Whereas there's something else, for example, your advice process, that's something that you don't want to get wrong. There's a whole lot of new requirements. So you're going to put a lot more focus on that in the early days, because there's more risk of getting something wrong when it's a new process. So licensees with more diverse operations generally have more formal processes and greater separation between the governing body and the staff. So in that case, you need to have more extensive testing to ensure that those processes and controls are working as intended. And for larger organisations, and particularly anyone I suggest that has got authorised bodies or interposed persons or nominated representatives operating under the licence, then you'd expect to see a very comprehensive, a very documented, well set out compliance assurance program, which is maintained and reviewed on a regular basis and describes all these different components, how your policies work and keep updated, your compliance calendar, what you do and when, any reporting that you do. We're going to talk about what an obligations register is and how that works. And any committees, for example, that might have a more focused oversight on the activity on the business. So your compliance assurance program should set out what is the scope of their oversight, what authority has been delegated to them by the oversight body, so that they might be doing a deep dive on a more significant issue or area, for example. Okay, so moving on now, we're going to talk a little bit about why you'd have an obligations register. So Alistair, do you want to sort of share your thoughts of that?
Yeah, thanks, Karty.
Just before you do, Alistair, can I just interrupt briefly and say I'm watching Q&A, guys. So if you've got any questions, please fire them into Q&A, and I'll pop them through to Alistair and Karty for you. Thank you, Alistair. Sorry about that.
That's all right. No worries. So what do we mean by an obligations register? We essentially mean a record in some form, and it can take the form. It can be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, or it can be operationalized via some kind of bespoke sort of system or off-the-shelf system. But it's essentially a means of recording the obligations to which you are subject in respect of the license activity that you are carrying out. So ideally, you would record in a plain English way a description of all the things that you must do on a line-by-line basis in order to ensure you maintain your compliance. That has obviously an obligation, an advantage that it creates a single source of truth for anyone in the business. If it's in plain English, it should be readily comprehensible by anybody who needs to know what the things are that you need to comply with. And then the second element is that it's usually, or it's ideal to ensure that that obligations register then links to the other elements of your compliance framework, so that, for example, you would record the obligation, which would be the restatement or statement of the standard condition in relation to license keeping. You would then also record and link to that the policies, procedures, and or controls that you have in place and that you've devised in order to meet that obligation. Then you would also link to that the records of the testing that you had carried out in respect of that obligation. So it would record, for example, the date on which you tested the whether those policies and controls were operating effectively, i.e. they were working properly. You would record the results of that test. So you would say it was deemed to be effective or deemed to be ineffective with these minor problems. You would record when you're next going to test it, and then following all of those things, you would report on those findings to your oversight body, which would be, so for example, to your committee. So you would provide a report that said this calendar quarter, for example, we tested XYZ controls in relation to these obligations. The results of the testing were as follows. Key issues for the oversight body to be aware of are whatever they may be, and recommendations as to the steps that should be taken in order to remedy those issues, if there are any, going forward. So if you compile an obligations register in this form that is a complete and comprehensible record of your obligations and provides a link to your controls that you have in place, how you're deriving assurance in respect of those controls and the results of those controls, has significant advantages in being a single source of truth in terms of managing your compliance obligations. It allows for easy access to and provision of information to the people who are responsible for the compliance processes, the management, for your oversight body, and for you to demonstrate to FMA, should that be required, that you are operating an effective compliance framework in respect of your business. So moving on to the next slide. One of the, I guess, the elements that will be of your compliance assurance program and that ideally would link into your compliance obligations register is your key controls. So your key controls are basically, it is a bit compliance jargony, key controls, but it basically means the important processes and procedures that you have in place to ensure that you meet your most significant or highest risk areas of obligation as a licensed financial advice provider, or whatever other type of license that you have. There's different types of controls that you might have and that you might reflect in your compliance assurance framework and in your compliance framework documentation. You can have automated controls, which are controls that are built into your systems that automatically ensure that the relevant thing either happens or does not happen. You can have manual controls, which would be you have documented a a policy and procedure that requires that somebody does something at a certain time. So, for example, it might be when a financial advisor has a specific interaction with a client, that financial advisor is required to enter a record into your record keeping system in respect of that interaction. You can also categorize controls, I guess, via another axis, other than them being automated or manual. So we can have preventative controls, which are the control in itself, which is the process, the procedure, the thing that exists, the system check stops something from happening. Or it's a detective control. So it means you have a process or a procedure in place that identifies that something has happened in the past, so you can retrospectively detect any compliance issues that may have arisen and take action to remedy those in the future. And then you can also have directive controls, which means the control states the action or policy to be followed. So, for example, training is a directive control. You train your staff and you tell them what to do, or you have a policy on conflicts of interest that requires your staff to do certain things where they have a conflict of interest. So that's a directive control. In terms of the hierarchy of controls, your strongest control will always be a automated preventative control. And if you have a high-risk process or you're conducting an activity that's likely to lead to significant potential liability or consequences, then that's the ideal scenario to be in. Whereas a directive control is obviously weaker because you're merely telling people to do something, which is less likely to ensure compliance than preventing somebody from doing something by means of a technical system. So, for example, a register of complaints would be an example of a detective control. Training would be a directive control, whereas reconciliation and segregation of duties might be preventative controls or automated controls, depending on, for example, if you set up your system to ensure segregation of duties. So that's what we mean by controls and key controls. And then the other area of the compliance framework, compliance assurance program, is that you should be then testing your key controls, which Karty alluded to. And as Karty said, you can't test every process and procedure that you have in your business. That would simply not be feasible. It also wouldn't be valuable. So you need to identify which ones are key, the key controls, and need to be tested. That can be risk-based, as Karty said, and there should be, ideally, you should document clearly the assessment of risk that you've undertaken, so that when somebody comes in and says, hey, why were you only testing these controls? You've said, well, we determined these were the highest risk processes in our business, so these were the ones that we were going to test. The other things that you need to bear in mind when testing controls, and by testing, again, that's a bit compliance jargony. What I simply mean by that is you check that the process or procedure or system is doing what it is supposed to do. So, for example, you might check a sample of records that have been set up and maintained in accordance with your documented policies and procedures. There'll be questions around determining how broad or large a sample you need to ensure that you have an adequate test. And that's really a question of judgment, but you want to ensure that you have sampled a reasonable range of records. Another key element to bear in mind is, as Karty alluded to previously, the testing process should ideally be done independently of the people who are involved in the day-to-day processes that you're testing. It's not very valuable if you get somebody to test their own work. It doesn't really provide a great degree of assurance that the control is operating effectively. So you can outsource that to an independent person. In a large business, you'll probably have a second-line compliance function or independent audit function who do that testing process. But in a small business, you don't necessarily need that degree of formality. So, for example, you could just have a peer review by one advisor of advice files that have been prepared by another advisor, and that could be your independent process for testing those key controls. And hand that back to Karty, who will go on to talk about compliance calendars.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alistair. So by now it's probably all starting to sound quite daunting and a lot of work, but I'll let you in on a wee secret that, the obligations register really is your key document. And if you can learn how to use a spreadsheet well, it's very easy because you can just put all these things in your spreadsheet and then you can filter them out. And what you find is when you start to put in all your controls, and I tend to put in the name of the control in a different line each time, and then when I filter them out, I find I've got a whole lot that look the same. Like it might give staff training on this, or attend a training session on that, or do CPD on such and such. And then I can group them together and go, actually, training is a key control because it crops up all the time. Now I understand what key controls are. Now, what crops up a lot on your obligations register. The other fantastic thing about an obligations register is you can use it to create your compliance calendar. So when you put in your obligation and then the name of the policy that you've created to meet it, and then the key controls that mean that you're going to meet that obligation, and then you put in a time frame. How often am I going to look at that control and review it or test it? You can then filter by dates. So you'll find that you'll get all these ones that are monthly and all these ones that are 6 monthly or half or annually, for example, some 3 yearly maybe. And then you'll look at them and you can say, oh my goodness, there is so much in monthly, there's no way I'll get through this. So that's when you take a second look and you go, right, let's take a risk-based approach of all these monthly activities that are popping up, which ones are really not that high risk, or I can push out a bit more. And that's how you start to manage your workload for the compliance side of things. So your compliance calendar is a really important tool now for scheduling out regular and often compliance activities that make sure that your controls are in place and they're working and you're meeting those obligations. Now, I like to explain compliance to a regulated entity at 2 levels. There's compliance with your license. So as a licensee, what are all the things that your criteria of license was based on, or all the standard conditions, or even any special conditions? So how do you know that you're meeting those? So I call that your licensee type compliance, or maybe business compliance. You then also got compliance for the activity that you've been licensed to do. So whether you're giving regulated financial advice, or perhaps DIMS, or funds management, or any of the other license type. So that's what I call the licensed activity compliance, or the product compliance, and often businesses forget that there's really these 2 types. So don't forget about testing and monitoring your obligations as a licensee, as well as your obligations for the licensed activity that you're providing. So when you take your obligations register and you spill out and you drill out the activities that you need to do on a regular basis, I now like to spread it out over a 12-month calendar and put in things that you know that you've got fixed dates in, first of all. This is really helpful. So, for example, every year you've got to update the company's office for your financial service provider listing. So you'll know the date for that because it's in the company's office. So put that in your calendar. Sooner or later, you'll have a regulatory return to provide to your regulator. So make sure you put the date when that's due in, so you've got plenty of time to prepare for that and get that filed. Any policies or a policy manual needs to be reviewed and updated at least annually. So it could well be that if your manual's quite small and nothing much has changed in your business, if you're quite small, you might just set a date for reviewing that maybe every 6 months, say when new guidance has come out. But if you're running a big business and you've got lots of policies and there can be lots of changes in your business, then you perhaps want to spread out and do a few policies every month just to make it doable so that you can get through the whole the policy set by the end of the year. Also, you might have mandated independent audits. Your product provider, for example, might require you to have an independent compliance review or a cybersecurity test or a data security test every year. You might have an AML independent audit to do every 3 years. Again, all those dates put into the calendar. And other important things like running a test on your business continuity plan. Will it actually work, the day that you need it, the day the next big flood or earthquake or volcano erupts? So that's the beauty of having a compliance calendar. So set yourself a few tasks every month, and then I tend to have this ad hoc page of things that I need to do every now and then, but it's just a prompt for me to look at it from now and then to say, hey, have I missed anything? Because it might be something that only crops up every now and then, and it's just that prompt or like a holding place of things that I know will be coming up. I just don't have a defined month in the calendar when I'm going to do it. So that's the beauty of the compliance calendar and how you create it very simply out of your obligations register. So the next important compliance activity is compliance reporting. Now, I was talking to somebody earlier in the week about their compliance activities. So they're a financial advice provider, and they're doing an awful lot of activity pre-vetting advice files before they go out, which is fantastic. So the compliance person is checking that the 6-step advice process has been followed. She's checking that the disclosure has been done, that the advice is suitable, and that the statement of advice tells the right story and is easy for the client to understand. Tick, tick, tick. So that all sounded really great. But I said, so what happens when you find an issue? Well, then I'll email the advisor and they'll fix the issue. Okay, so that's great. So you know that you're giving compliant advice. But the part that she was failing to do is she wasn't capturing the outcomes from all the activity that she was doing. So, for example, how do you know which advisors are regularly making mistakes? So then we've got a training issue. How do you know when a new advisor to the business is suddenly giving really good advice and is actually ready for more responsibility or maybe more complex advice, for example? How are you tracking the improvement? So if you're giving feedback to the advisors about what they can be doing better, you need some way of capturing all your activity to give feedback. So this is where compliance reporting is really important. So not just doing the compliance activity, but having a simple way of tracking and measuring what activity is that you're doing and trying to learn from what these compliance activities are telling you about the business in terms of any trends or reoccurring issues. For example, any consistent mistakes that advisors in different parts of the country are making. To me, that becomes my next training plan. Okay, we're going to cover off some of these issues we've got with replacement business advice or not changing disclosure when something, has changed with the advisor and things like that. But it's absolutely critical that the oversight body gets information flowing up to it in terms of, well, what compliance activities are you doing and how do we know? How do we know that we're meeting our regulatory obligations and everything is running as expected? Now, when you're newly licensed, your regulators understand that everything that you've created and designed in your compliance framework, it's all new. So when you have something new, a new process, it doesn't always work out the way that you intended when you designed it. You forgot something, or it just doesn't quite work in practice, or maybe it's a bit rigid for the business, it needs easing out a bit. So this is why you need testing and monitoring and some reporting in terms of what's working and what isn't working. So what do you then report? Well, you report what do you know about what's happening in the business? What is it that you're reviewing? What is it that you're finding? And what did you do about the issue that you uncovered? And are you giving feedback to people in the business, both good and remediatory. So don't just give feedback to the people who are getting it wrong. Actually, support and encourage the people who are getting it right, because a new regulatory regime is not easy for anyone. All this information is really important to your oversight body, because they're going to make key decisions based on what you're telling them. Things like, do you need more help? Do you need more resources in that area? Or are things going well? Can we actually grow and expand our business because we're really comfortable with the way that our compliance activities are working? So some of the things that I think is really important that you report on a regular basis is the status of your compliance assurance program. Are those controls in place? Are they working? What sort of things have you had to fix? What did you have to iron out? Complaints and any issues, there's going to be time to time where you have a significant complaint or you have a significant issue to fix. A lot of the questions I'm getting at the moment is this a reportable issue to the FMA? So you've got to sit and think about the issue and think about it in the terms of, at the moment, your business is the frontline regulator. You're self-regulating what's happening in your business. If it's something more significant or material, yes, absolutely, you'll need to report it to the FMA. If it's a privacy breach, you might need to report it to the Privacy Commissioner, for example. So there's some of these judgment calls that have to be made. And so your oversight body really needs information on what type of judgment calls you're making in that area so that they get comfort that you're getting it right. Because remember, ultimately, it's the directors of the business that wear a lot of that responsibility if things go wrong. So this is why they need the assurance. Key business risks is something always to keep your eye on. Nothing can kill a business quicker than not keeping your eye on emerging risk or strategic risk, not having a future, or operational risk, somebody making a big mistake that we hadn't planned and can't remediate quickly. But also, I think reporting has to take a future focus as well. What's coming up on the horizon? And I like to think of the compliance person as a really key partner in terms of enabling new opportunities. If you have a really good process for reviewing new product design or financial advice in a new area, then you can actually help the business grow in a safe way. You're not there to be the brakes, you're not there to be the policeman, you're actually there to help enable, but actually give them specialist advice about the regulatory landscape. But also any regulatory change. The next thing on the horizon is we have COFI, or Conduct of Financial Institutions. So we need to keep thinking about, as we're building our policies and procedures and our compliance, that we're building it with the future in mind. And that way, change won't become a burden and you won't get caught behind with what you need to be doing going forward. So that's the importance of compliance reporting.
I'll just chip in. I think there's one point I wanted to add on that, Karty. In terms of reporting and your compliance reporting, I think it's also important to, report on whether your compliance assurance program is actually working or operating as it was designed to, in terms of, are you doing the things you said you would do at the time you would do them? So, for example, if you're overdue for testing a number of key controls and you haven't tested them in that quarter, that's information that should be relayed to your oversight body as part of your compliance reporting, because that means they need to realize that, there's probably resource or other constraints that means you're not executing on your compliance assurance program. And that's something that can get you in trouble with the regulators. And they come in and say, well, you said you would do all these fantastic things, testing your key controls every quarter, but you've only tested 10 of them and you have 20. So what's going on there? So I just thought I'd just interrupt to make that point. So back to you now.
Absolutely. Good call. Okay, so the next topic we're going to discuss is, we hear this term fit for purpose quite frequently. And what do we mean when we talk about fit for purpose? So really, you might imagine that a compliance consultant such as myself has created a compliance assurance program template stick a company's name on it, Bob's your uncle. But actually, it's not that easy. Every single compliance framework and compliance assurance program might have common elements to it, but it has to be bespoke for your business. Because one thing that, I learned at looking at so many license applications, there is no such thing as two identical businesses in New Zealand. So every company has a different focus, a different structure, a different set of challenges, a different type of technology that it works with. So all this needs to be thought through as you document out your compliance assurance program. And it very much needs to be targeted towards the type of license that you have. So say, for example, if you've already got a license, say you got a DIMS or a MIS manager license in the last round, and you're now adding financial advice, regulated financial advice provider to that license. Well, you're going to need to do a full review of your compliance assurance program and say, right, what other obligations do we need to add in? What other compliance processes? What specific oversight do we need to focus on while we land these new set of obligations and make sure that we integrate this into our business? So this is what part of being fit for purpose is all about. So you've really got to consider how big is your business, how complex, the amount of scale. You might be a small business, but you might have a large number of customers, or you might have a large amount of funds under management. All that plays into the design and the setup of your CAP. Really important to review the FMA's commentary. And, we put that link to the FMA's guide on compliance assurance program. There's also commentary in the license applications, but there's also a lot of commentary that's sort of come out in their feedback reports from when they go out and monitor and supervise entities. And they'll come back and give you the common themes in terms of, here's an example of something good that we saw, and here's an example of something that didn't work so well or not good. So what they expect you to do is every time a new guidance note comes out, self-manage by rating yourself against that guidance note and say, if 80% of the entities out there are failing in this area, there's a good chance that we've got a problem too. So let's front foot it and self-manage and fix it before our monitoring visit. So if you need comfort in terms of, have I created a robust compliance assurance program? Then absolutely get somebody independent in to review it from time to time. And make sure that when you design it, you're thinking about what are the key business risks? What are the emerging issues? So if you're, for example, a financial advice provider, advice and conduct risks are really the key hot topics at the moment. Are you embedding regulated financial advice and all the new components to it? For a lot of the advice businesses that we're working with at the moment, it's a big step up from where they were to what these new requirements are. And it's going to take a bit of time to really embed this in your business. No surprises that there's a worldwide focus on cybersecurity risk. I've got this mental vision that during lockdown, all the teenagers sat on their computers and worked out ways how to hack you. So, we're more under threat of cybersecurity issues than ever before. So let's make sure that you've got a really robust framework in place for that and you understand how it works. And normally it's just about doing the basics really well. This is the time where you might need a specialist review to come in and have a look and give you some guidance on that area. And the other big one, obviously, too, is financial stability. Have you got enough to ride through some of the issues, the events, the unexpected that might occur over the next few years to ride you through that? So that's always an important business risk to be thinking about. So the last slide, and then I'm going to hand you back to Alistair. So we're going to talk about your compliance budget. So thank you for that. So I think in this day and age, you do need to start to think about setting yourself a budget for compliance. Even if you have a lot of processes that you can self-manage your compliance yourself. There might be times that you need somebody to do a deep dive, or you have an issue that you just need a second pair of eyes to help and guide you. There'll be times that you're dealing with something that's more complex or higher risk, and that you might need specialist legal advice or IT advice or compliance advice, for example. You'll get benefits from getting an external set of eyes from time to time. But you also need to think about your internal day-to-day compliance. And my husband always says to our clients, I can't get any, I think I do everything perfectly, and then Karty comes along and everything's wrong. So what he's saying is that second pair of eyes is really valuable. They'll pick up on things that you may not see yourself because you're so close to the business. So see if you can find yourself that second pair of eyes. It is really important to keep compliance sustainable. And I think everyone in the industry is very conscious of that. And I really hate scare tactics. So when we work with clients, we're really trying to work on ways on how can you self-manage this as much as possible. And things like your obligations register, your compliance calendar, understanding control testing, documenting out your compliance framework. These are all the ways that you'll do it, because that'll help you understand compliance from that perspective. If you're part of a FAB, or you may be an authorised body under a large entity, you might be a head group or aggregator type FAB, often they'll charge you a compliance fee. Well, make sure that you fully understand what that compliance fee covers, because there could be some gaps. There could be some areas they expect you to take care of yourself, or there might be some areas that, because they're looking after such a large group, they can only give you a certain series of checks on a regular basis. Remember that your business is unique to who you are and what you do. So from time to time, there might be something else that you need to have tested or checked. So make sure that you don't just rely on that set fee and assume it will cover everything, because ultimately you're still responsible for your own compliance. And if you think a compliance obligation register sounds like a lot of work, you're right, it is. They take a lot of time to set up and get right, but they're really important to your overall, I think, compliance health. If need be, you can always buy a compliance register, but then you've got to customize it to your business, because your policies, your controls will be unique to your business. Your testing framework will be unique. But there's nothing wrong with getting a leg up and getting a help with getting that started. And not all people are good at spreadsheets. Yes, you can work with them in Word. They're just not quite so easy. For larger organisations, absolutely start to think about risk and compliance software. I think that can be really helpful. The critical thing with risk and compliance software is if your manual processes, if you don't understand them or if they don't really work in practice, then swapping to a software system to automate it may not help you very much. You might be just paying a license subscription for what's effectively a large spreadsheet. So I always suggest get it right manually first, and then look at software systems after that. All right, so I'm going to hand back to Alistair now. We're going to look at the regulatory reporting requirements.
Yep, thanks, Karty. Now, just I guess reiterate one of the key themes of Karty's last two slides is the importance of ensuring that your processes, your compliance framework and your documentation is tailored to your business and effective and fit for purpose. Because from a legal perspective, the worst position to be in where you have an FMA review or inquiry is that you've written down something, that you take something off the shelf, you've written down, you said you'll do something and you haven't done it, because that immediately puts you on the back foot. So you do need to ensure that whatever you document is sustainable and something that you can execute on an ongoing basis. And that's really important, as Karty said. I'll just briefly whip through this. I think we're running out of time, but I thought it was worth dwelling on these because your compliance assurance program and framework may, if they are operating effectively, identify issues. And you should be aware that you are subject to ongoing reporting requirements to FMA in respect of those if they do arise. So just a quick summary. If you have a full license, you need to report any material changes to your business under standard condition 7 of the full license standard conditions. And there's detailed guidance in that document as to what that means. But you're also subject to obligations on an ongoing basis to report material contraventions of license obligations or material changes in circumstances. Material contraventions not further defined, and there's not a tremendous amount of guidance from FMA that's relevant to that, although guidance issued to supervisors of managed investment schemes on a broadly equivalent obligation suggests FMA considers a precautionary approach should be taken. I've often found it useful in considering this to have regard to some guidance that ASIC put out, so the Australian regulator, on their equivalent regulatory reporting regime, although it's been updated since that guidance was put out, so it's old guidance. But that basically things, when you're considering whether something's material, factors that you might want to have regard to, and therefore reportable to FMA, include, I guess, the number or frequency of similar previous breaches that you've had, the impact of the breach on your ability to supply the financial advisor service effectively. Does it undermine your ongoing capacity to deliver the service effectively? Whether there's any actual or potential financial loss or other harm to your clients, whether there's any fraud or deliberate misconduct, which would tend to suggest that it was material, and the importance of the obligation which has been breached. Is it a technical minor reporting obligation, or is it one of the fundamental obligations in the legislation designed to ensure customer protection? When you've considered all that, then you'll need to, if you do think it is material, you will need to report that to FMA, and the requirement is to report it as soon as practicable. So ideally, as soon as you're reasonably able to do so. There's also a requirement to report a material change in circumstances, which is a bit convoluted, but it effectively means something has happened which has significantly degraded your ability to effectively act as a financial advice provider. So, for example, if, I don't know, half of your workforce had resigned on one day and you no longer had sufficient capacity to service your existing clients, then that might be something that was a material change in circumstance, or you've lost access to some key system that you rely on to deliver your service. That could equally be a material change of circumstance and should be reported to FMA. And then finally, I'll just very quickly say, FMA welcomes self-reporting, especially, I think, in a new license regime like financial advice provider regime. FMA's guidance on its sort of regulatory response and enforcement policies reflect that. But it's key that if you are self-reporting, you do so on a sort of full and transparent basis, because if you sort of only report half of a problem, that's not likely to assist you as the full depth of the problem inevitably becomes uncovered. So that's there. So yeah, well, I think who's going to the summary slide, me or you, Karty?
Oh, you do your bit and then I'll jump in.
Okay, so I think summary there is kind of summarizes everything up. Now you're regulated, you need processes, and so you need, you comply and you can demonstrate to those to FMA. Process needs to be fit for purpose for your business size and scale. Back to you, Karty.
Yeah, look, and your time is probably the biggest focus. So budget and time, and you do need some resources for this. So whether you have spreadsheets set up, whether you've got people, it's all dependent on your business. Lots of things can be automated, so you'll get skilled at those over time. But with anything, remember that we're operating under the Financial Markets Conduct Act. So it's all about culture and conduct. So whatever you design, remember to design with the client in the centre. So Mark, that's it from us. I hope that gives a good overview of compliance and compliance assurance programs to our audience.
Thank you, Karty. Thank you, Alistair. And I think that your key word there was overview. This is a time when many financial advisors have moved from being financial advisors who are running their own books to people who are having to be directors of businesses that are liable for these obligations under the Financial Markets Conduct Act. And for many principals of financial advice providers, this is actually quite a significant change. I think the key thing that I'd like to finish off with is, if you are not confident in this area, if you're not confident in governance and oversight of a regulated company, if you're not confident in what compliance is, get help, get training. seek some advice, look for some of the training courses that are out there, and do get familiar with this stuff, because it is your obligation to ensure that your business is meeting all of these requirements. And the more you understand it, the more training you get, the more confidence you get, the easier this will be, and the less of a mind, this Pandora's box, this explosion of things of, oh my God, how do I get on top of all of this? The more you know, the less that will be an issue for you. So a huge thank you to Karty and Alistair for sharing your expertise on this matter. The last thing I guess is, this is our December Get in Shape webinar. Have a wonderful Christmas. Thank you very much for participating in this series. We hope it's been helpful to you. We look forward to having a bit of a break and a bit of a breather over December and January, and getting back in to get future ready in 2022. Thank you very much, everybody.